Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where it's about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Riverdale. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, after nearly having his house burned down, luckily Archie and Jughead were able to put it out, but obviously there's no fire department in Riverdale anymore, so Archie tries to go and start one. Basically, the previous fire chief has been retired, but he actually worked with Archie's grandfather, so he's trying to get him to, hey, come out of retirement, help kind of build the next, the new branch or brand of the fire department for Riverdale. Obviously, the fire chief is kind of like, it's a young man's game, so he backs down. But Veronica has a connection from New York to an actual firefighter from New York, so they get him to come to Riverdale to train. And obviously at the same time, Jackson, who served under Archie, is in town. So together, they're training some other people. At first, they try to go to some close friends, including Fang and Kevin, but as well as others, but obviously it was kind of a no-go on that front. So Archie and Sarge end up kind of convincing the ROTC volunteers. Well, it's more so they were convinced because obviously they heard a little bit about Archie, and Archie's like, nah, like you have football practice, ROTC, and me making you volunteer firefighters. It's like, yeah, but you're doing all three too. So they were inspired by hearing, Jackson's story about how, like, yeah, if it wasn't for Archie, he would have lost more than a leg. He's like, I'd be in a body bag right now. So hearing how much Archie's willing to do for them, and so. And it's interesting, too, because I think even Jughead admitted, like, he was actually kind of shocked that, like, Archie isn't going for, like, the throat when it came to, like, Hiram. He was like, it's not worth it, like, going after Hiram. Because in the past, anytime Hiram would do something like this, Archie would go toe-to-toe with him. And it's like, for Archie not to do that, I think it's, shows how much he's grown, knowing that, probably after his experience, it's like, that's not the solution. Like, if we're going to fight fire with fire, you're literally, like, we're going to have to go about things differently, like, because the way I handled things in the past, I think Archie recognizes, like, it was a temporary solution to a long-term problem, so I think that's kind of at least how I kind of view the whole situation. But obviously we saw kind of the beginnings of the training going well, and obviously, Archie feeling, a man came in there thinking that the gym had been shut down, and it's like, oh, because obviously he was someone, sadly, that was living on the streets, and later on kind of turned out like, oh, he was someone that served us well, that, obviously coming back home, sadly, things didn't work out. He wasn't, taken care of like he should have been. And so seeing that, I think, reminded Archie, because he was like, okay, hope you're able to, speak, he's heard those words before about people trying to, keep things alive in Riverdale. For him, it's like, I hope it's just more than words. I think that kind of spurred them on. Sadly, fire happened next door, and Earl was in the building, and Archie rushed in to save him alone, because it's Archie. But sadly, at the end of the day, Earl ended up dying, and that set Jackson off, because for him it's like, what was the point of us going off, like, seeing what we've seen, fighting it, like, putting our lives on the line for what? Just for us to be treated like dogs over there, but also to come home and not be treated well either, to like not have like a good life waiting for us after everything we went through. And also for Earl to die, it's like, it just, for him, that was just like the final straw, because it's like, is that what we're destined for? Like, we come back home just to live on the street until we die, and just because we kind of fade into background and kind of become no one in that regard. And so for Jackson, obviously he's not able to get the help he needed, because he was on the list to get help, like a veterans program, but he ended up, getting taken off the list. So he feels like he's spiraling, which Archie even says, I'm doing it too. Like, it's not just out of the good nature of his heart. Like, wanting to save Riverdale, I think, yes, there's a part of him that wants to do it because, he has to do it in his father's stead. But I think also there is a part of him, he even talks about it, like, doing it is because he feels he's spiraling. Like, the only thing that's keeping him sane, it gives him a mission. It gives him something to focus on. Because if he didn't have that to focus on, he'd probably be drowning in his own demons right now. And this gives him a way, and I think, once again, even for Archie, that's a temporary solution to a long-term problem. So hopefully that's something, because Archie's like, he doesn't have anyone to really confide into except for Jackson, because he's like, I haven't told my friends about it because it's not something they'd understand. Like, only person that can understand him is Jackson. They went through it together. So for him, it's a situation that, like, I'm hoping that both of them are able to get help, and that's, and that's a sad thing, that they're carrying this thing because they feel like no one could understand, even if they try to explain it to someone. Just like, unless they were there with them in the trenches, like, you could never fully understand. And I don't know. Like I said, I feel like this is kind of like setting up the tipping point for Archie, in the sense that, like, I think we can definitely see some stuff later on where Archie might kind of start falling apart a little bit, like, just because maybe things aren't going according to plan, and just like any potential setbacks could just be something that ends up, potentially, I don't know. He says that him and Jackson can serve to kind of keep each other sane, but I'm kind of worried when things might go sideways that might not be an option. I mean, especially because Jackson was so close to killing Hiram, because, like, for him, it's like rich people like that, like, kind of being able to get and do whatever they want to. It's like they've seen enough people like that. That's why, like, Jackson was trying to have was about to do that. But, like, Archie, who's, had Hiram kind of mess up his life in more ways than one, is like, don't ruin your life trying to go after Hiram like that. Killing Hiram is just going to destroy your life. Don't do that, So it's gonna be interesting to see where things kind of go on that front, especially because obviously the fire chief at the end, because Weatherby was like, yeah, you aren't allowed to be taking high school students, especially without permission, into burning buildings. But the fire chief shows up, as well as Veronica dropping off a fire truck. Because obviously for her, it's like, I'm doing my civic duty by helping, but also hurting my dad at the same time. It's like, anything for you, Archie. It's like, okay. Which I'm wondering, are we potentially, especially as it's going to get complicated considering him and Betty's situation, where it's like, oh, it's super casual, but then it's like, well, considering where her marriage is right now, and I'm thinking, like, maybe it'll kind of rekindle some flames, but it's like, that also depends on whether or not the whole him and Betty thing just stays the way it is. Oh, just fun. Like, hopefully no one ends up catching any feelings, but I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe there won't be a Veronica and Archie thing. Maybe it will be rekindling flames. Maybe it won't be. It's going to be interesting. Just in that moment, it's just kind of like, oh, you see little sparks flying, so you're like, I don't know. It's been a couple years. A lot's changed. They've both changed. So who knows? Obviously there's stories of people who rekindle years later, relationships after years of being apart. So, so there's that side of things. And speaking of Veronica, in this episode, her attempt to help Riverdale, they're kind of back against her dad, is basically, with Cheryl's help, she's basically printing fake money. And she had brought up a story, and I'm wondering how true that is and how far back in time that was. She was saying that basically it was a time where Oregon was basically, they printed their own money, apparently. And so she's doing the same thing, but basically getting people to spend money in Riverdale so that she can compensate it with the $50,000 she has for selling her that jeweled egg she had. So it was like, okay, we pump $50,000 into the economy, get the money flowing, and I put that real $50,000 out there, so to kind of get people, like, it was like, oh, like, it's kind of an interesting thing that I'm wondering, like, modern day, like, obviously Riverdale's kind of in this bubble, just obviously with the time frame it takes place in, because it's very ambiguous, because it blends present day and like 50s, 60s aesthetic. So I'm wondering, could that only happen in a town like Riverdale? I'm sure you definitely probably couldn't do that in like a metropolitan area or something like that, but a small town like Riverdale, or you can probably make that happen. But granted, that kind of ends up backfiring because, hey, which I also thought was kind of shitty that her dad was like, oh, even in my audacious moments, I never thought to put my own face on my own money. It's like, I'm sure you've thought of it. I don't believe it. I'm sure you've thought. You're too narcissistic not to think about that. But I guess that's kind of the whole point about, I'm so narcissistic, I never even thought, I guess that's kind of the whole point he's making, but I kind of don't believe him. But obviously it's there, like, oh, it's like, oh, look what you're doing, Veronica. Oh, it's cute. Like, he wants, because he knows that if he can, like, like belittle her like that. I think for one, there's a part of him that likes belittling her just so. I think for one, to make himself feel better. It's also his way to kind of stick the knife in and twist it a little bit. It's like, you stuck the knife in me and twist it. I'm doing the same. But I also think it is because there's a part of him that likes it, because he likes that the fire get lit. Because obviously she kind of did it to him in the past. I think he's kind of doing the same thing, because it's like, honestly, you are my daughter, so I love you. So I actually like there being a fire lit underneath you. You want to challenge me? You want to come after the king? You've done it in the past. Haven't necessarily 100% succeeded, but go ahead. Give it a try again. Well, she kind of succeeded last time, but we'll see how things kind of go on this front, because she thought her dad's the one that was pumping money into the economy, but turned out not to be her. It was her own students. They kind of got a little ahead of themselves, got a little greedy. Instead of pumping 1,000 like Veronica wanted to, because it's like, we don't need to do this fast and hard. Like, we need to do it slow and steady. And they got greedy. And now it's like, okay, now you're basically causing an economic collapse, because I don't have the 10,000 to cover the river money, the river dollars that you just pumped into the economy. So got to work it off, and they're kind of cleaning up. So that's interesting. And the fact is, I mean, well, and like I said, Hiram gets some joy off it, because she was like, I know you did this. He was like, actually, and at the end of the day, it turned out he actually didn't. I was almost halfway expecting it being a thing of like, oh, he paid her students to do that. It's like, oh no, they did it at their own volition. Because why? Because they're high schoolers. They got greedy. They thought they could like, oh no. It's like, oh, they didn't think it through that, things would work on, they didn't think about the long-term ramifications for what they were doing. I mean, hell, even the short-term ramifications for what they were doing. But, so that was an interesting development. Whether or not that continues as a thing or not, we'll ultimately have to wait and see, because that might be like because of this, we can't, because for it to be so easily, of a combustible situation like that, all it takes is someone to flood the market with others. Like, it doesn't even have to just be her students. Anyone else could do it. So I'm curious, is Veronica going to pivot, or is she actually going to continue down this route? That's going to be interesting in the long run. I think Veronica's probably going to try and find another solution. But like I said, she might continue down this route. Like, it's such an uncontrollable situation, like I said, because you've seen that just your students can print more and dilute and once again cause economic collapse to a certain extent. So it's like, if it could definitely happen on an even larger scale. I mean, not luckily, but sadly, Riverdale's already in a position where it's like, well, we're not in the best position, so it's not like this completely screwed over Riverdale, because Riverdale was already screwed over to begin with, so it didn't make as big of a dent as it could have, but like I said, we'll have to see where things kind of go on that front. There's the Tony and Cheryl situation, which I love. Cheryl's like, no, the Vixens are mine. I'm going to run things, challenge you to a dance-off, which I love Tony being like, I'm pregnant. Because even I'm like, yeah, what do you want her to do? Bust a move while she's pregnant for her to, like, I guess, depending on how pregnant she is, she could end up inducing labor doing that. Or at least, like, getting her water broke or whatever, making her water break. Getting her water broke. Jesus. I don't know why you worded it like that. But once again, like, the look on Tony's face when, like, which I even love Cheryl challenge, it's like, oh, you look, she's like, normally I don't, like, want to crush, like, high schoolers or whatever, but it's like, you seem insufferable, so I'm going to, which I love that, coming a little bit from Cheryl, considering Cheryl's personality and everything, so it was interesting. And obviously it's like her and Tony are like, oh, she's like, fine, we'll kind of run the Vixens. I thought it was really interesting, and once again, you see that look on Tony's face, it's like, yeah, much like I'm saying Hiram might be trying to light a fire underneath Veronica, I believe that's what Tony did. Because Tony kind of talks about it later on, because it's like, oh, like, you've been so separated from the rest of Riverdale, from the world, you've kind of cut yourself off these past couple years. So she wanted to bring Cheryl back into the world, considering, hey, what everyone else is doing as well. Because it's like, a lot of people have come back to Riverdale to try and help save it. So it's like, which is, kind of sad, because obviously the Vixens are very important to Cheryl. And I figured that's why Tony did what she did. Like, it was meant to do that. But obviously the experiment didn't go the way she thought it would, because Cheryl kind of, Cheryl is Cheryl, so she's kind of running things her way. But then Tony kind of calls her out for, like, yeah, like, we're supposed to be co-captaining this thing. But also, it's like, you've kind of isolated yourself for so long. Like, this isn't Drag Me to Hell, which I thought, oh, neat reference. You kind of self-cursed yourself, you know, because it's also like, essentially was kind of like, you've gotten away with a lot of terrible stuff in this town because of your money and privilege. So it was almost kind of sad because you can tell Tony was almost making comparisons to how, like, Hiram's been running things. Because for her, it's like, money isn't just going to be enough. Like, everyone is doing their part. It's like, why don't you join us here on the ground floor and, like, you know, be on the good side of things, which is almost sad because it's almost like, wait, you're vilifying, you know, Cheryl, because Cheryl's like, you don't know what it's like to be me, like what she's going through at the time and stuff like that. And I should also note, there was also that depressing line of like, she's like, oh, I've seen like, she was telling the vixens to run faster because she's like, I've seen a porcelain doll possessed by my dead brother move faster than you. I was like, gee, that's a reference they're not going to get. The only person who's going to get that reference is your Nana Rose and Tony. But I'm like, that's a depressing ass, like, reference to make. It's because then it's gonna be like, that's a weird metaphor. It's like, no, that was super real. You had to be there for it, you know. That's crazy. But nevertheless, but Cheryl was saying that Tony can be so cruel because I guess it's like, you're saying all of this, you know, it's like, you're the one that kind of forced me out. Like, I didn't want to be here, but you, whether Tony will admit it or not, she kind of did it on purpose. But like, her bringing Cheryl out into the world kind of backfired a little bit. So she was expecting Cheryl to kind of handle things a little differently. So I don't know. It's almost kind of like, well, Cheryl, what did you expect? Like, Cheryl doesn't play second fiddle to anyone. But it's also, I think Tony was also kind of counting on, like, considering their history, that, you know, there's still something there, whether, like, you know, maybe the spark isn't as bright as it used to be, but that spark is still there to a certain extent. And she was hoping, like, you know, because that's how they ran things beforehand. Because it was like it wasn't just Cheryl's, it was ours. But like, for Cheryl to kind of not represent it as theirs, like, I think for Tony, it's almost like a slap in the face to like everything that they held before. It's almost kind of, you know, so. But I mean, maybe even Cheryl kind of looks at it from that same point of view. When she was saying, you know, oh, Tony, you can be so cruel. So I just thought that was an interesting development. Obviously, things get even more interesting on the Cheryl department because it's like, oh, Miss Marple, you're here, yeah. Oh, yeah, because it's painting of your brother. Yeah, it's a forgery. And before I contact the authorities, I think we should talk. So it's like, okay. Ironically, Tony's like, oh, be part of the good guys. And Cheryl's about to, well, she's already been doing, like, to compensate for, like, the family money she has to, like, you know, which is ironic because Veronica had her, like, basically make fake money while she's actually forging paintings. But it's also interesting because I think now we're going to see Cheryl ironically go down a more criminal route, at least, you know, white-collar crime, at least. I mean, no crime is good crime, but it's not a harmless crime. Like, it has its ramifications as well. But compared to a lot of other crimes, you'd at least, if someone's going to do something criminal, you're like, at the very least, do something white-collar crime-wise. Some people probably made the argument, white-collar is kind of actually worse, because like, that's a debate all in its own right. Like I said, just your personal views on the situation. I'm sure you can sway that opinion any other way. Regardless, my whole point is, I think Cheryl's going to go down the white-collar crime route. I think that lady's like, yeah, why don't you do this more for me? Like, your forgeries are actually really good. We can make a killing off of selling your... So it's going to turn into a whole business and enterprise. So we're supposed to probably start off as maybe one. Who knows how far her and Nana Rose were going to go with that, but they're probably going to go a lot deeper and a lot steeper since they've been found out. So it's probably going to turn in more and more of a thing. So now, whether that's eventually going to catch up to Cheryl, just because I don't think none of the Blossoms have actually gotten away with any of the stuff they do. At the end of the day, they've all kind of paid the price for what they've done. So we'll ultimately have to wait and see where things go on that front. It's definitely going to be interesting to see. Another angle to this is Jughead still investigating the Mothman thing. And obviously Tabitha still has like the biggest reservation, even though he found these articles. But there was an eyewitness to like a bright light or something that happened at Pop's, and said witness was Pop Tate himself. And so obviously he brings up the story and just about like this light, how it wasn't just him, other people were there, including Nana Rose. you know. But Pop said a line I thought was kind of eerie, like it kind of correlates a little bit with this Mothman thing. It's like he's like, yeah, like the bright light. He was like, I actually was kind of wanting it to come back. It's like a Dreyfus dude being like, oh, I kind of wanted to be taken by the Mothman. I was actually kind of looking forward. Like it was something of a similar vein. Pop had said something that immediately hit me, where he was like, "Oh, like some people thought was space aliens, but another theory, and this one that it seemed like he ran with was kind of more like it was military experiment type of stuff, because there was like a military base nearby." And I was like, that was kind of my initial thought, and I'm thinking we're going down more that route. We'll get to it soon enough. But Nana Rose talked about the fact is that they found a Mothman body, and they had it, autopsied. They were supposed to get rid of it because she's like, oh, the Mothman showed up asking for it, but it's like, I didn't get rid of it. I stuffed it in a barrel of syrup, and obviously she shipped it over, and Tabitha and Jughead are looking at it, and it's like, we don't know what that is. We can get an expert to come look. But then all of a sudden, Jughead has his experience. It's like, yeah, I was drinking a little bit, but I lost a couple hours. So, and also the body's gone. I take this as I don't think this is like a supernatural thing at all. Like, obviously they haven't really, obviously, because even the Gargoyle King thing ended up not being the supernatural thing either. But I think, honestly, it's a military thing. I think the military at the time, all those years ago, were taking people and experimenting on them, because it's Riverdale. It's like, oh, it's a small town. Like, no one's going to miss a couple missing people here and there. Like, obviously, they're going to chalk it up to alien stuff, so we're able to kind of, like, it's just like, oh, it's kind of like town folklore, so it's not that big of a deal. Also, the fact is, a lot of that got buried. I mean, and like I said, just got simply chalked up to people being a little crazy. I think it's got to be like the military running experiments on people, and it's like that body is proof of the experiments they were running. So they heard, like, wait, some people were running their mouths about Mothman. Someone's looking into it. They found out that Jughead and Tabitha had the body at Pop, and so they ended up taking it, I think that's what this is. I think it's not going to be an alien thing. I think what they're going to stumble across is a conspiracy. Like, it's probably like some off the books, off the records, like hush hush experiment stuff that was handled that the military is trying to cover up. Maybe, like, I don't think it's aliens. I could end up being wrong, but I think it's just purely like, and I don't even think it's military covering up aliens. I think it's the military covering their asses from, like, some super shady stuff that they did back in the day. That's how I chalk it up to, and I think that's what the bright light is. It's probably like a helicopter or something like that. You would think, like, if that was the case. But it would also make sense why, like, the lights would go out and stuff like that and then come back on all of a sudden. I'd assume, like, that's a EMP type of thing. Well, we'll have to wait and see, but that's my current running theory. Could end up being totally wrong, but we'll see. Another angle to this whole situation is, to the episode, is Betty and Alice obviously still looking for Polly. They found a body, but it turns out that body wasn't Polly. It might be another missing woman, Margaret, but it turns out later on, because obviously Betty ends up talking to Margaret's mom, and it's like, they used to be on better terms, but the moment Margaret started hanging around the truckers and stuff like that, that's where they kind of started distancing apart. And obviously, she went missing 3 years ago, but there's not much Keller could do, because for one, he did everything he could, but he's one sheriff in a town that was already dying. Riverdale was already going through so much too, so she didn't hold it against Keller. But obviously, they want to search the swampland because they ultimately ended up finding Polly's phone there. But Hiram being like, whoa, this is private property. I'm like, don't be a dick. Like, you want to put on a perception that you're a good guy, that you're not the asshole everyone knows that you are. I guess, like, he no longer has any, it's not like even Hermione was able to, rein him in that much. He was, obviously, we saw how much of an asshole, but I think it just, these 7 years have probably hardened him even more with his daughter away and just everything kind of falling apart. The business not even being here. Hermosa taking the rum business. Like, I think this is kind of all, like everyone else, I think he's got his plans, and like kind of like the opposite to Archie, where it's like saving Riverdale's all he's got. Destroying Riverdale's probably all Hiram's really got. Well, we don't know what his grand plans are. Can we get a little peek into it this episode because of conversation with him and Reggie? We'll get to that in a second. But it's like, he's like, yeah, as a father and having a daughter of my own, I understand your plight, but it's like, yeah, I can't have you running around private property. But it's also like, like I said, you would want the perception of a good guy, but I guess it's like, why do I need to have the perception of anything? I get why he did it, though. I'm not saying, like, in a sense, I support it. It's all, no, I get why Hiram would do it, because it's like, he said it himself, like, oh, this is supposed to be my turnpike. The last thing he needs is investigation slowing down the turnpike showing up, but also, like, for there to be like, oh, there's bodies here and shit? Nah. Can't have that, because obviously that's going to make it extend even more. But Reggie's the one that actually let Betty know about, hey, I actually found a body here. Hiram is aware of it, but he wouldn't want you to know about that, because, once again, it draw too much attention to it. But luckily, Reggie was like, hey, I don't know how they found out. It's a big swamp, but, they probably found it on their own. But not unless Reggie didn't tell Hiram about the body he found. Because I think, who knows? Because Reggie never really went into specific. All he said was, like, he went searching, so it could have been after the fact. And, like, yeah, if you find anything else, tell me. Maybe he had told Hiram at that point in time. Maybe he didn't. But, so it also shows you Reggie isn't the complete monster. Yes, it seems like he's kind of halfway in, halfway out. Or at least mostly in. But, considering the circumstances, it's like, yeah, burning someone's house down, because I'm sure that was Reggie. Maybe it wasn't. Reggie doing some of the shady stuff he's done, but, like, this is also someone's sister stuff. But he also looks at this as an opportunity. It's like, hey, you come off looking like the hero if you let them investigate this swamp. And also, yes, the turnpike gets pushed back, but who cares? If you benefit from it, perception-wise, which was kind of my point to begin with, but whatever. But also, it's like that and Sodale aren't. So it's like, okay, so they're just smaller pieces to a grander plan. Now, what he's like basically saying, they're like basically the red herrings, like turnaways from what he's really up to. Now, what that necessarily entails, we don't know. So that's going to be an interesting development to find out what he's really up to. But this third body ends up being Margaret, because the second body ended up being an unknown woman. So I know obviously that body's been there. That unknown body had been there for like 3 years. So no telling who else or what else they'll find. Because obviously Tom does his own investigating, like along the Lonely Highway, like how it connects to other places. Him and Tony coming at it from a social worker standpoint, and obviously there's crossover between their lists. So altogether, there's 21 missing women. Like 5 of the names off of Tom's list match with the names on Tony's list. So there's a good chance it's like, okay, are we dealing with a human trafficking situation? And obviously for Betty, or we're dealing with a serial killer, which obviously Riverdale's had its own serial killer, that being the Black Hood. But this circumstance is a little different, because this isn't just allocated to one town. It's one specific road, the Lonely Road, that connects to other towns. So this killer's just found its way to Riverdale. I mean, granted, we have no idea. This is somewhat their stomping grounds, considering like the swamp area was where at least 2 bodies were found, as well as Polly's phone. So another angle to this also too is TBK, the trash bag killer, has made his appearance. And I didn't think about this at the time, because I'd already previously, because of like I said, watching Silence of the Lambs recently, I had drawn the parallels, obviously the direct parallels between TBK and Buffalo Bill, especially from what we've seen of what happened to Betty, which I'm sure that in itself is probably what pushes her even more about trying to find her sister, especially if this ends up being the case, because, she was held captive for wasn't it like 2 weeks or something like that. So I think that probably motivates her even more to it's not only just because it's your sister that's missing, but also potentially someone missing, what that can necessarily entail. Betty has a different perspective on things, and I don't know how much the public knows about that, in particular her friends. So, everyone's got their own stuff they're dealing with that none of them are talking about. Like, Jughead has not told anyone about his money issues. Veronica hasn't really talked too much about her complicated marriage and what that necessarily means, and Betty hasn't neither Betty nor Archie have kind of either talked about some of their, trauma, so. But the point I was also making was, obviously with all this Mothman stuff, it didn't even correlate in my head until this episode. I was like, right, because that was Buffalo Bill's thing, was moths. So it's like, I didn't recognize that was another angle they were throwing, paralleling and just kind of, nodding to Silence of the Lamb. I didn't even realize that until now. I'm like, oh, why didn't I necessarily get that the first time they brought out Mothman? But regardless, a lot of interesting stuff. It's a lot of stuff to keep in mind as we, I'm sorry, I'm a little scatterbrained right now. I'm really curious to see where all this ends up taking us going forward into the next episodes. Some very interesting developments across are waiting for us. Once again, sorry, scattered brain. Yeah, I'm excited to see where this all takes us next episode. That's all I'm trying to say. Sorry. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.